Let me continue this beautiful story for you. I hope everyone followed the first part and are already following us, because every week there's always a friend to share a little about this wonderful life God gave us. Miracles rarely arrive as explosions. Most often they come as whispers, so gentle you might miss them if you're not paying attention. And that's precisely how my miracle began. Not with thunder, but with a neighbor knocking on my door with a fruitcake in her hands. We'd been living in the new cottage just 3 days when she appeared. She was a woman in her 70s, small and wiry, with a smile that lit up her entire face and silver hair tied in a neat bun. "Hello, love. I'm Mrs. O'Sullivan. Live just there in the yellow cottage round the corner. Thought I'd come welcome you." She extended the cake. "Baked it this morning. Still warm it is." I was so surprised I could barely react. When was the last time someone had done something kind for me without expecting anything in return? "Thank you," I managed to say, taking the cake. "Would you like to come in?" Just for a minute. Don't want to be a bother." But that minute turned into an hour. Mrs. O'Sullivan sat at my humble kitchen table, drank the tea I offered, and chatted. Really chatted. Not that superficial neighbor talk, but conversation from someone who genuinely cares. I told her about Thomas, about everything we'd been through, and she listened, truly listened. "Love," she said when I'd finished, "you're stronger than you realize. And you know something? God doesn't bring us to a new place without having a purpose in it." "Purpose?" I gave a humorless laugh. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I can barely get through the day. What purpose could I possibly have?" She looked at me with those wise eyes, full of lived experience. "You'll discover it yet. But you will. Mark my words." Over the following days, more neighbors appeared. Mr. Keene, a retired postman, who offered to fix the dripping tap in the kitchen. A wife, a single mother with 3 children, who brought clothes her boys had outgrown. Perhaps they'd do for cleaning rags or something. Young Connor from down the lane, who asked if I needed help with anything heavy. They were simple folk, most as poor as us, living in cottages as humble as ours. But there was a richness there that had nothing to do with money. There was community, there was solidarity, there was love, and there was something else. They had problems that I discovered I could help resolve. It was Ioifa who planted the first seed. She'd come to borrow some sugar. The shop had closed, and she needed to make dinner for the children. Whilst we chatted at the door, she mentioned, "Maggie, you're well educated, aren't you? Thing is, I've this letter here from the Social Welfare Office that I can't make head nor tail of. Been there twice, but the clerk speaks all complicated and I end up more confused." "I can have a look," I offered. She returned with the letter. We sat at my kitchen table and I began reading. It was about the lone parent's allowance she received. They'd stopped the payment and she didn't understand why. I read the entire document, decoded the bureaucratic language, and explained it to her in plain words. "It's because you need to update your records. Look here, it says it's been over 2 years since you last updated your information. You need to go there with these documents, birth certificates, proof of address, utility bill." Her eyes widened. "That's all. But the man there never explained any of that." "That's all. Take those documents and request to update your records. They'll likely reinstate your payment." Oph hugged me so tightly she nearly knocked me over. "Thank you. Thank you so much. You've no idea how much this helps." 2 days later, she returned with a beaming smile. "Got it sorted. updated the records and they said the payment returns next month. Maggie, you're an angel." I wasn't an angel. I was just a woman who could read documents and had patience to decipher bureaucracy. But for a wife, that had changed everything. And then it started. Mrs. O'Brien from the Blue Cottage appeared with a letter from the bank. Mr. Donnelly came with a tenancy agreement he didn't understand. Bridget brought papers about her late mother's estate. Word spread through the village. "Go see Maggie, she understands these things." Suddenly, my small kitchen table became a meeting point. Every afternoon someone was knocking at the door with papers, with questions, with problems that needed untangling. And me? I helped. Simply helped. At first I did it out of kindness, but gradually I realized something. It made me feel good, made me feel useful again, made me feel that, despite everything I'd lost, I still had something to offer. Thomas noticed the change. He'd sit in the sitting room, in his chair near the window, listening to the conversations. And I saw something resurface in his eyes. Interest, curiosity, life. One day, when a lady left after I'd helped her complete an application for high-cost medication, Thomas called me. "Ma, G." I approached him. "Yes, love?" He pointed to where the woman had just left, and with great effort said, You help." My eyes filled with tears. "You help me too, Thomas. More than you know." Because it was true. Having him there, observing, sometimes trying to offer an opinion with gestures or truncated words, gave me a sense of purpose beyond just caring for him. We were a team again. Different from what we'd been before, but still a team. It was Mrs. O'Sullivan who suggested I formalize it. "Love, you're doing social work here. Have you considered doing this properly? There's a community center near the church that offers space for activities. You could have a set day, fixed hours, help more people in an organized manner." "But I'm not a social worker," I protested. "I've no qualifications." "You have something better than qualifications. You have heart and you have practical wisdom, and that's worth more than any certificate." The idea kept nagging at me. Could I really? Did I have the capacity for that? I prayed about it, took my Bible and read Proverbs 31:20. "She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy." And I felt that quiet voice again, the one that speaks directly to the heart. This is why you're here. I sought out the community center coordinator, Mrs. Fitzgerald, an energetic woman of about 70 who dedicated her life to helping the village. I explained what I'd like to do. "Every Wednesday afternoon," she decided immediately. 2 until 5. You sit at a table in the hall and see whoever needs help. I can even make some flyers to distribute. Help with documents and bureaucracy, free of charge. And thus my ministry was born, the word Father Brendan used when he learned of the project. Every Wednesday I'd leave Thomas comfortable at home. Mrs. O'Sullivan had offered to keep an eye on him. Take my folder with pens and some reference documents, and go to the community center. At first, 5 or 6 people appeared, then 10, then 20. I helped with everything, completing social welfare forms, interpreting medical bills, letters of complaint to companies, basic guidance on employment rights, things that were simple to me, but for those people were impossible mountains. And something miraculous began happening. People started bringing offerings. Not money. Nobody there had spare money. But they brought what they could. One brought a bag of potatoes. Another brought vegetables from the garden. Someone appeared with a jar of homemade jam. An elderly lady gave me a pair of slippers she'd been given but didn't fit. "It's not much, Maggie," they'd always say, "but it's with love." And it was more than enough, because adding up the small offerings from many people, Thomas and I had food on the table. It wasn't abundance, but we didn't go hungry, and there was a special flavor to that food, the taste of gratitude, of community, of shared love. Thomas began improving. Not physically. The paralysis remained there, stubborn, but emotionally. He smiled again. Got excited on Wednesdays, waiting for me to return to tell the day's stories. Began making effort in the physiotherapy the health center offered twice weekly. And then, 3 months after I'd started at the community center, something extraordinary happened. It was an ordinary Wednesday. I was helping Mr. O'Connell, a gentleman of 70, understand why his pension had been denied, when an elegantly dressed woman entered the hall. She was visibly out of place, expensive clothes, designer handbag, perfectly styled hair. She looked around, located me, and came straight over. "Are you Margaret, the one who helps people with documents?" "Yes, that's me. Can I help you with something?" She sat down. "My name is Dr. Catherine Walsh. I'm a solicitor. One of my clients, Oweef Kelly, told me about the work you do here. I was curious and came to see." My heart tightened. Was I doing something wrong? Invading some professional area without knowing? "I don't charge anything," I explained quickly. "And I don't give legal advice, just help people understand basic documents and—" She raised her hand, smiling. "Relax. I haven't come to cause trouble. I've come to make a proposal." I explained to Mr. O'Connell that I'd return in a moment and took Dr. Walsh to a quieter corner. "Mrs. Murphy, what you're doing here is precisely what's missing in this country. Access. Access to information. Access to basic rights. But you're limited because you haven't legal knowledge for more complex cases. And that's where I come in." "I don't understand." "I'd like to volunteer. Once a month I'd come here on this same day and see cases requiring legal guidance, free of charge, pro bono as we say. And you'd be my bridge to the community. You know the people, know the needs, can do the screening." I was speechless for a moment. "Why would you do this?" She smiled, but there was sadness in the smile. "Because I grew up in a village like this. Managed to study, became a solicitor, improved my circumstances. But I never forgot where I came from, and I've always wanted to give back, but didn't know how. Until a wife told me about you. I accepted immediately. And thus began a partnership that would change hundreds of lives. Once a month, Dr. Walsh came with her solicitor's briefcase and saw complex cases, divorces, maintenance payments, employment disputes, inheritance problems, free of charge, all free of charge. The news spread, the project grew, other professionals began appearing, a retired accountant offered help with tax returns, a doctor volunteered to give basic health guidance once a month, a teacher offered adult literacy classes. The small space Mrs. Fitzgerald had given me became a complete service center. And me. I became the coordinator of it all without even realizing. The woman who months ago was sleeping on the floor in her son's house, without hope, without prospects, was now helping transform an entire community. It was one evening, 6 months after starting the work at the center, that I sat in the front garden with my Bible. Thomas was sleeping, the cottage was quiet, and the sky was full of stars. I opened to Ephesians 3:20. Now to him who is able to do immeasurably, more than all we ask or imagine, according to His power that is at work within us. And then I understood. God hadn't just pulled me out of the pit. He'd transformed my pit into a well from which others could drink, had transformed my pain into purpose, had transformed my broken pieces into something useful, something beautiful, something that mattered. I thought about everything I'd lost, the cottage, financial security, the life we'd planned, and I realized something revolutionary. If I hadn't lost all that, I never would have come to this village, never would have met these people, never would have discovered this purpose. God hadn't caused Thomas's stroke or our tragedies, but He'd taken those tragedies and woven something beautiful from them, had transformed mourning into dancing, as Psalm 30:11 says. But the greatest transformation was yet to come, because God hadn't finished with me, and in ways I could never imagine, He was about to show that the impossible is merely the warm-up for a miracle. Thomas began speaking more. Not much, and the words were still truncated, but he began managing to form short sentences. Maggie, water. Thank you. Love you. Especially that last one. Love you! Each time he managed to say it, my heart overflowed. It was Dr. Walsh who noticed something I hadn't perceived. We were chatting after a session when she said, Margaret, have you considered studying, taking a course in social work or something similar? You have a natural talent for this. Study? Dr. Walsh, I'm 53 years old. I left school after my leaving cert, and I haven't money for... There are free programs, technical courses, adult education to complete studies, even university for mature students. I can help you research. The idea was absurd. Or was it? Gradually, that seed planted by her began growing in me. Study, qualify myself, do even more, even better. I spoke with Thomas about it. He got excited in a way I hadn't seen in ages. With gestures and words, he encouraged me. Go, you can. I found a technical course in community development offered by a charity organization. It was evenings, twice weekly. Mrs. O'Sullivan offered to stay with Thomas those days. At 53 years old, I returned to studying. It was difficult. My brain was rusty, the tutors were too young, and I was by far the oldest student in the class. But I persisted, studied in the early hours after Thomas slept, read and reread until I understood, did the assignments with obsessive care. And do you know what I discovered? That it's never too late. That age is just a number. That when God places a purpose in your heart, He also gives you the capacity to achieve it. My children were proud. Liam hugged me and said, Ma'am, you're my inspiration. Siobhan wept with joy. Finn posted a photo of me with my books on social media with the caption, My mother is the strongest woman I know. The work at the community center continued growing. It wasn't just Wednesdays anymore. Now we had activities nearly every day, craft workshops to generate income, discussion groups about mental health, legal surgeries, rights guidance. And I was at the center of it all. Me, Margaret, who months ago thought my life had ended. 1 year after we'd moved into that humble cottage, I received a call from the county council. They wanted to know about the project, sent a team to assess. And 2 weeks later I received the news. The project would be officially supported by the council. We'd have a small monthly budget, office supplies, and even a modest salary for me as coordinator. A salary for doing what I loved, for helping people, for living my purpose. When I told Thomas, he wept. Wept with joy, with pride, with gratitude. God, good. he said, squeezing my hand. God good. And it was true. God was good. Not because he'd removed our problems. Thomas was still in a wheelchair. We still had financial difficulties. There were still challenges every day. But because, even in the midst of all that, he'd given us purpose, had given us hope, had given us a reason to wake every morning. I'd learned something fundamental. Miracles aren't always about restoring what was lost. Sometimes miracles are about creating something completely new from the ashes of what was destroyed. They're about discovering you're stronger than you imagined, more capable than you dreamed, more loved than you believed. But even with all this transformation, I still hadn't seen the greatest miracle. That was saved for the end. And when it finally happened, I'd understand completely why I'd been through all of it. Because God's ways are mysterious, but never without purpose, and my journey from shattered to sacred was about to complete in a way I could never, ever have imagined. 2 years. 2 years since the day that changed everything. 2 years since the stroke that destroyed our life as we knew it. And now, sitting in the small office at the community center that had become my second home, I looked around and could barely believe all that had happened. The place was packed. More than 60 people waiting for appointments. Some for legal guidance with Dr. Walsh. Others for the literacy classes with Mr. O'Brien. Others still to speak with me about documents and bureaucracy. The walls that had once been gray and peeling now had fresh paint and colorful murals created by the village children. Where there'd been just one rickety table, we now had 8 service stations. But it wasn't the physical space that had changed most. It was the people. It was the lives. A wife, who couldn't understand the welfare office papers, had now returned to education and was studying to be an administrative assistant. Mr. O'Connell had managed to sort his pension situation. Bridget had resolved her mother's estate and used the money to open a small bakery. Story after story of transformation. And me? I'd completed my technical course in community development with top marks in the class. At 54 years old, with a certificate in hand and tears in my eyes, I'd proved to myself it's never too late. The council's salary had increased somewhat, enough for us to live with dignity. It wasn't much, but it was ours, it was honest. It was fruit of my labor. Thomas had improved significantly. Still used a wheelchair, probably would for the rest of his life. But he spoke far better now, could even manage small tasks independently. And do you know what he did every Tuesday and Thursday? Came with me to the center, sat near the window and chatted, in his way, with simple words and gestures, with other people who'd had strokes or other physical limitations. He'd become an inspiration, living proof that life doesn't end when the body limits you. And I saw in his eyes something I hadn't seen in years. Purpose. But it was on a Tuesday in March, an apparently ordinary day, that the true miracle happened. The miracle I didn't even know I was asking for. The miracle that would complete the circle in such a perfect way, it could only have come from God. I was at home making lunch when Thomas called me from the sitting room. He was agitated, pointing at the television. "Ma! Jay! Look!" On the telly was a news report. An international charity was making a documentary about transformative community projects across Europe, and they were looking for stories to include in the film. "How lovely," I commented distractedly, returning to the kitchen. So many people doing beautiful work out there. I thought no more of it, but Thomas apparently did. A week later, I received an email on the old laptop the council had donated to the project. My heart raced as I read, Dear Mrs. Murphy, we received notification of your project through Mr. Thomas Murphy. We would like to schedule a visit to learn about the work developed at the community center and assess the possibility of including it in our documentary. I looked at Thomas, who was in the sitting room with a mischievous smile on his face. You did this? He nodded yes, proud. In recent months, with much physiotherapy and determination, Thomas had managed to regain minimal use of his right arm. Could type slowly on the mobile, one letter at a time. And he'd used that newly recovered ability to write an email to the charity telling them about our project. Thomas, my voice failed. Why? You deserve, he said with effort. World needs. No. The documentary crew came 2 weeks later. There were 3 of them, a director, a cinematographer, and a producer. They spent the entire day at the community center, filming, interviewing people, recording everything. They interviewed a wife who told how that simple gesture of me explaining a document had changed the course of her life. They interviewed Mr. Keene, who spoke about how the project had given him back his dignity when he thought he was no longer useful. They interviewed Dr. Walsh, who explained how the voluntary work had reconnected her with her roots and given new meaning to her career. And they interviewed me, sat with me in the front garden of our humble cottage and asked about my story. About Thomas's stroke, about losing our home, about hitting rock bottom, and about how all that had transformed into something beautiful. I wept during the interview, not from sadness but from gratitude, because there, telling my story aloud to those cameras, I finally saw the complete picture, saw how each broken piece of my life had been carefully repositioned by God into a new design. A design I never would have chosen, but which was infinitely more beautiful than what I'd planned. If you could go back in time, the director asked me, and prevent all this from happening, the stroke, losing the cottage, all the suffering, would you? The question caught me by surprise. I sat in silence for a long moment, truly thinking about it. No, I finally answered, I wouldn't. Because if none of that had happened, I never would have discovered who I truly am. Never would have discovered my purpose. Never would have helped all these people. The suffering was real, it was painful, it was nearly unbearable, but the growth that came from it, that's priceless. After they left, I sat with Thomas in our small sitting room. Do you think they'll use our story in the documentary? I asked. He shrugged. Doesn't matter. Already. Miracle. And he was absolutely right. Being or not being in the documentary didn't matter. The miracle had already happened, was happening every day. But God, it seems, hadn't finished surprising me. 3 months later, I received another email. The documentary was complete and would be shown at an international film festival. And more. Our story had been chosen as one of the main segments of the film. We would like to invite you, together with Mr. Thomas Murphy, to the documentary premiere in Dublin, all expenses paid. Thomas and me at a film festival. It seemed surreal, but we went. Liam, Siobhan, and Finn came too, all dressed in their best clothes. We entered that posh cinema in Dublin city centre, so different from our simple village, and watched our story being told on a giant screen. I wept from beginning to end. We all wept. Because it wasn't just my story there. It was the story of everyone who's ever felt broken, lost, without hope. It was the story of how God takes broken pieces and works miracles. But what happened after the screening was what truly changed everything. A woman approached me at the reception after the film. She was elegant, in her 60s, with a presence that commanded respect. "Mrs. Murphy, my name is Patricia Brennan. I'm chair of a foundation that works with community development. Your story touched me deeply. I'd like to discuss a possible partnership." Over the following days, I learned that the Brennan Foundation was one of the largest philanthropic organizations in Ireland, and they wanted to invest in our project. Not just invest, they wanted to replicate it in other vulnerable communities across the country. "Your model is simple, effective, and replicable," Patricia explained in a meeting. "It's precisely what we've been looking for. With our structure and your knowledge, we can transform hundreds of communities." I could barely process it. From helping half a dozen neighbors at my kitchen table to potentially impacting hundreds of communities across Ireland. "But I'm just a simple woman," I protested. "I haven't training in project management, don't know how to—" "You have something far more valuable than qualifications," Patricia interrupted me. "You have lived experience. You know what it's like to be in those people's place, and that can't be learned at any university. The rest we'll teach you." The partnership was formalized. The foundation invested in complete renovation of the community center. They hired more professionals. They set up a training program where I'd train other people in other communities to replicate the model. And they offered me a salary that was 3 times what I earned from the council. 3 times. Money enough not just to live with dignity, but to begin saving, to plan, to dream again. "We're going to be able to buy a cottage," I told Thomas that night, my voice full of emotion. "A cottage of our own again. Not as large as the one we lost, but ours. And it'll have everything adapted for you. Ramps, special bathroom, everything." Thomas wept. They were tears of pure happiness. "God faithful," he said. "Always faithful." And it was true. God had been faithful. Not in the way I expected, not in the timing I wanted, but always, always faithful. In the months that followed, the project exploded. The documentary was viewed by millions of people online. We began receiving donations from across Ireland, people who'd seen our story and wanted to help. Some donations were €5, others 1,000. But each came with a message. Your story inspired me. You gave me hope. If you managed it, I can too. I trained the first group of facilitators, 20 people from different communities who'd learned the method to take to their villages. Looking at those 20 people seated in the training room, I saw myself 2 years ago. Broken people, exhausted, but still with a spark of hope in their eyes. You're going to change your communities, I told them on the first day. Not because you're special or extraordinarily gifted, but because you know what it is to suffer, know what it is to need help. And that empathy, that first-hand knowledge, is the most powerful tool that exists. 1 year after the documentary premiere, Thomas and I moved into our new cottage. It wasn't large, 2 bedrooms, just like the one the parish had given us. But it was ours, purchased with the fruit of my work, my sweat, my reinvention. On moving day, when I placed the last box inside, I sat on the floor of the empty sitting room and simply looked around. Thomas was beside me in his wheelchair. We managed it, I whispered. Against all odds, we managed it. Not us, Thomas corrected. God managed through us. And he was absolutely right. That evening, with things more or less organized, I sat in the front garden of the new cottage with my old Bible, the one my mam had given me over 50 years ago. now even more yellowed, even more marked, but still so precious. I opened to Isaiah 61:3. To bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of His splendor. Beauty instead of ashes. That's exactly what it was. God had taken the ashes of my destroyed life and woven a crown not of gold or precious stones, but of purpose, of impact, of transformed lives. I thought about everything I'd lost. The original cottage, Thomas's full health, the plans we'd made. And then I thought about everything I'd gained. Purpose, community, the joy of making a difference, a faith tested and proved, a marriage that had been refined by fire and emerged stronger. Had it been worth it? The question echoed in my mind, and the answer came clear as crystal. Yes. 1,000 times yes. Not because the suffering was good. Suffering is never good. But because God is good. And He's so good, He can transform even our worst day into the beginning of something miraculous. Today, 5 years after Thomas's stroke, I coordinate a network of 52 community centers spread across 12 counties in Ireland. I train new facilitators every month. I speak at conferences about community development. We've directly helped over 18,000 families. Thomas has improved significantly. Still uses a wheelchair, probably will for the rest of his life. But he speaks far better now, can even manage small tasks alone. And do you know what he does every Tuesday and Thursday? Goes to a support group for stroke survivors that we created at the center, where he shares his story and encourages others. He's become one of the project's most beloved volunteers. My children are well. Liam saved his marriage and now has 2 beautiful daughters. My granddaughters. My joy. Siobhan qualified as a nurse and works at the hospital where Thomas was treated, completing a beautiful circle. Finn is engaged to a wonderful girl, and they're getting married at year's end. And me? At 57 years old, I discovered that life can begin at any age. That God doesn't need perfect people. He prefers broken people willing to be rebuilt. That the darkest valley is merely the setting where the greatest miracles happen. Last week, a young woman of 30 came to the center. She'd lost everything in a house fire. Cottage, belongings, documents. Was sleeping in her car with 2 small children. She sat before me and broke down in tears. "I can't bear any more," she sobbed. "I see no way out. I think God's forgotten me." I held her hands and looked into her eyes. Eyes I recognized because they'd once been mine. "He hasn't forgotten," I said with absolute conviction. "I know because I was exactly where you are. And look where I am now. God hasn't forgotten you. He's simply writing a story you can't yet see the ending of. But I promise you, it's going to be beautiful." Yeah, we helped her with emergency housing, with new documents, with food parcels, with referrals to assistance programs. And as she left, with a little more hope in her eyes, I thanked God, thanked Him for breaking me, thanked Him for allowing me to fall so low, because only then could I genuinely reach others who are down there. This is my story, the story of a woman who lost everything and discovered that everything was nothing compared to what God wanted to give. The story of shattered pieces transformed into mosaic. The story of how the worst day of your life can be the first day of your greatest adventure. If you're reading this, if you're in the valley, if you're on the ground surrounded by broken pieces, hear what I have to tell you. Don't give up. I know it hurts. I know it seems impossible. I know you're exhausted. But God specializes in impossibilities. He's master at taking what's destroyed and making something new. And he hasn't finished your story yet, not at all. In Jeremiah 29:11, it's written, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Hope and a future. Not the ending you planned, not the ending you imagined, but an ending full of hope. And often, that ending is more beautiful than anything we could have dreamed. Today, when I look back, I see God's hand in every detail. See how He positioned me exactly where I needed to be. See how He used every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of despair to mold me, strengthen me, prepare me. The broken pieces of my life were transformed into a beautiful mosaic. And do you know what's most incredible? The mosaic is only beautiful because of the broken parts. If nothing had broken, there'd be no art. So thank you, God, for the broken pieces. Thank you for the breaking. Thank you for loving me so much. You didn't let me remain in my comfort zone. Thank you for forcing me to discover what I was capable of. And to you who's reading, your broken pieces are going to become a mosaic too. It might not be today, it might not be tomorrow, but it will happen. Because the God who began the good work in you is faithful to complete it. From shattered to sacred, that's God's specialty. And if He did it with me, He can do it with you. Believe it. Simply believe it. Now to Him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to His power that is at work within us, to Him be glory in the Church and in Christ Jesus, throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen. Ephesians 3:20-21. Goodbye, my dear friends.